All right, everyone. So let's talk about this attack on Russia by Ukraine. Biden came out some days ago and he said, I give permission to the Ukrainians to attack Russia, not to attack the Russian military in Ukraine, but to actually attack Russian soil, to launch missiles into Russia itself. And so Putin came out and told Biden, okay, Biden, you want to play that game? I'm going to change Russia's nuclear doctrine. Well, how did Putin change it? What changes did he make? The change is that if a country attacks Russia in cooperation with a nuclear power, that the Russians will see such an attack as directly coming from the nuclear power, as something done directly by the nuclear power. And Russia will see such a situation as fitting for a nuclear response. So everyone's talking about World War III. Everyone's talking about America being pulled into a nuclear war with Russia. And they're looking at Biden and they're saying, oh my goodness, this crazy ass old man is going to be the destruction of us all. He's going to lead us to our destruction. He's already leading us to our destruction. We need a hero who's going to be a peacemaker, who's going to establish peace between Russia and Ukraine and really just end this quagmire, end this inferno, this mess, this abysmal disaster, this nightmarish situation. We don't want to be a part of this. This is not our war. Russia has nothing to do with us. Ukraine has nothing to do with America. We don't even know where Ukraine is on a map, whatever. And so what happened after Biden gave the green light to the Ukrainians to launch American-made missiles into Russia? Trump came out and he said, Biden is starting World War III. I'm going to end World War III. Everyone is now looking up to Trump as the peacemaker. Now, I'm trying to make sense of this whole situation because there's something strange about all of this. Because for a while, the Ukrainians were begging. They were begging the Americans for permission to use these American-made long-range missiles. They're known as ATACMS, by the way. ATACMS is an acronym. It stands for Army Tactical Missile System. Yes, I did read that because I can't remember that. I just can't remember that title. But anyway, I just call them ATACMS for short, just for the sake of convenience. I call them ATACMS. But there's a line here from the New York Times that I want to read to you guys. And I was looking at the media today, both American and Russian, and I want to try to get both sides. And there is an excerpt here from this article. It was published by the New York Times on this whole story. And there's an interesting excerpt here. So it says here that the U.S. supplied Ukraine with ATACMS for the first time in October of 2023. But the missiles were designed to hit targets only about 100 miles away. So last year, the United States gave Ukraine these ATACMS, and they said, okay, we're going to give you these missiles, but these missiles are limited so that you can only hit a target as far as 100 miles away. That's it. So they put limitations on Ukraine. Why? Because they don't want to escalate a direct war between, they don't want to escalate the whole situation into a direct war between the U.S. and Russia. So they put limits on how Ukraine can use these missiles. And it says here in this article, the Biden administration only provided a small number, less than 24 in the first shipments. And the move came only after a Ukrainian counteroffensive that summer had failed. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive was a complete failure. And the Americans said, okay, we're going to give you some of these ATACMS, but we're only going to give you 24 of these ATACMS. And they're limited on how far you can fire them. So why were the Americans putting these limitations, imposing these limitations on how the Ukrainians can use these missiles, if America really, really is serious about escalating this whole situation into a direct war between the U.S. and Russia? So the article goes on to say that in April of 2024, the U.S. agreed to secretly provide ATACMS with a range of 190 miles to Ukraine. However, so they increased the number of miles that they could hit these missiles at. And it says here, however, the Biden administration restricted their use to targeting Russian forces located in Ukrainian occupied territory, including Crimea. So the Americans said, okay, we're going to give you some more missiles. You can fire these missiles a little bit farther than before. So instead of 100 miles, you can hit a target 190 miles. But you can only use the missiles against targets within Ukraine itself. You can't launch the missiles into Russia. So, and again, this was earlier this year. This was in April. Why is it that now we're at the point where Trump is about to come into his presidential position months from now that Biden all of a sudden says, okay, Ukraine, you can hit Russia. You can launch the missiles into Russia. Why only now? Why only months before Trump takes office? And here is me just putting on my conspiracy theory hat. I could be completely wrong. I am putting myself in risk of having egg in my face. I am putting myself at risk of people saying that I'm full of whatever. But I'm going to give you guys my little conspiracy theory here. All right, here we go. So this whole situation reminds me of what happened before Reagan took office and after Reagan took office. So Ronald Reagan was running against who? Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the president. Jimmy Carter was dealing with a disaster, the Iranian hostage crisis, the Tehran hostage crisis. A bunch of Iranian militants took a bunch of American envoys as hostages. Why? How did this happen? What led up to that? I'll tell you. So the Shah of Iran, who was the king, he was the last king of Persia. He was the last Persian king. He was dying from cancer. So the Americans said, well, you're dying from cancer. We got the best medical professionals that can treat cancer. So how about you come to New York? Well, Jimmy Carter was against this idea. And Jimmy Carter himself, Jimmy Carter said, if you bring the Shah of Iran into New York, the fanatics in Iran are going to start saying that the Shah is in cahoots with the American enemy, and there's going to be a revolution, and you are going to be seeing violence attempted against U.S. envoys in Tehran. They didn't care. They said, no, we want the Shah to come to New York. Who was pushing Carter to bring the Shah into New York? Freaking Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, the big Chase Bank guy, the one who was running Chase Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank. They were pushing Carter to bring the Shah into New York. Carter was resistant to the idea, but he reluctantly acquiesced to their demands. Makes you wonder who's really in charge here. So the Shah of Iran comes to New York, and David Rockefeller himself said, if you bring the Shah, it's going to cause militant violence against U.S. envoys in Tehran. So freaking David Rockefeller knew what was going to happen, which makes me think, it makes me wonder if the whole thing was a conspiracy. So the Shah comes to New York, bam, the Iranian hostage crisis commences. Because they said, the Shah is in New York. He is in cahoots. He is collaborating with the Americans. Boom. They attacked the U.S. embassy. They took American hostages. So now Jimmy Carter has a huge disaster on his hands. He's trying to make a deal with the Iranians, and the Iranians are toying with Jimmy Carter. They're toying with this guy. They pretend that they are about to agree to a deal to release the hostages, and then they pull back. And this made Carter look weak. Oh, look, Carter, he's so weak. And then Reagan enters office. He won the presidency. He enters office. And right after he entered the presidential office, the Iranians released the hostages. And then all the Americans started to say, look, our hero Reagan, he's so strong, so powerful. He's so intimidating. The Persians are so terrified of him. They're just pissing in their pants in the presence of our great leader Reagan that they released the hostages. And this is a myth, by the way. And this myth of the tenacious Reagan terrifying the Persians into releasing the hostages still lives on today. There are still people who believe this. But if you actually take the time to read about what actually was going on behind the curtains, you'll find out that the whole thing is BS. So what was going on? Reagan's people, amongst whom was George Bush Sr., were telling the Iranians, play with Carter. Pretend that you're about to agree to a deal to release the hostages and pull back. Pretend that you're on the verge of agreeing to a deal, pull back, pull back. pretend to agree, pull back, toy with Carter, make Carter look weak. These CIA guys, let me tell you, they know about human psychology. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They know all about human psychology and how to make people have a certain perception of things, how to enforce a particular narrative in the eyes of the people, the whole thing. They know how to present a narrative. They know how to present a certain idea, a certain ideology. They know how to market. They really do. And so they made Carter look weak. And in exchange, the Americans told the Iranians, in exchange for doing this for us, for helping Reagan, we're going to do arms deals with you. We're going to sell you American weapons. And the Israelis are also going to sell you weapons. Oh, yeah. And you had Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, who was one of the main figures behind this conspiracy. And they told the Iranians, keep the hostages until Reagan enters office. Keep the hostages until Reagan enters office. And what was the point of this? The point was to make Reagan look strong. They wanted to boost up the image of Reagan because he was this major Cold War figure. So I'm thinking, for a while, the Ukrainians have been begging the Americans for permission to use these long-range American-made missiles, and the Americans have been telling them no. They told them you can use the missiles against the Russians in Ukraine, but you can't launch those missiles into Russia. We're not going to allow that. And then months before Trump is about to enter office, they tell the Ukrainians that they can launch the missiles into Russia. It makes me wonder, why at this point? Why? And I'm wondering, perhaps it's because the people who are in the highest echelons of power in the United States got together and they said, listen, this whole Ukrainian situation is a disaster. It's not making NATO look good. It's making NATO look weak and bad. Plus, we, the Americans, want to shoulder the responsibility of Ukraine on the Germans and their European allies, because we want to focus more on China. So we need to give time to the Europeans to increase and to boost up their military strength. And that's why you see the Germans and the French and the British talking about bringing back mandatory military conscription. And a lot of Ukrainians have been killed. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed. And they say that 500,000 or so, or really hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed and wounded. So this is a disaster for Ukraine. Ukraine is being drained of manpower. Ukraine is being utterly exhausted. So Ukraine needs to rest. Ukraine needs time to train more soldiers, to recruit more soldiers, to build more weapons, to buy more weapons, or be given more weapons. We need time for all of this. We need time to refresh the entire military machine of NATO. And so we need to pull back. Now, if Biden pulls back, that's going to make Biden look weak. But we have Trump here, who's an isolationist, and the majority of the American people want America to not be involved in these wars. And so we're going to put Trump in there. And we want people to see Trump as a peacemaker. We want to boost up the image of Trump. So what are we going to do? We're going to escalate things months before Trump enters office. We're going to terrify everyone. We're going to scare the hell out of everyone. And then Trump's going to take office and he's going to say, I'm the peacemaker. And he's going to make a deal with the Russians. And if a deal is made, and this is just me thinking here. I'm not saying this is emphatic. I'm not saying this is 100% going to happen, but this is just me thinking. This is my own personal analyzation. But if Trump makes a deal with the Russians, if the Americans agree to a deal with the Russians, a part of that deal is going to be Ukraine ceding territory to Russia, because Russia right now controls 20% of the territory. Russia has suffered high casualties. A lot of Russians have been killed. This has not been easy for the Russians. And the Russians have already said, listen, we're going to take what we conquered. So in order for Ukraine to have a peace deal, it's going to have to give up territory. And Zelensky said, well, even if we give up territory, the territory that we're going to give up is still going to be seen as officially a part of Ukraine by the international community. And that's probably true. But it doesn't matter because effectively it would still be Russian land because it's going to be treated as Russian land. There's going to be Russians living there. There's already Russians living there. There's going to be Russian soldiers there. You're going to have Russian deployment to this area. It's going to be effectively Russia, right? In light of the international narrative and in light of the international world order and how it works, it's effectively going to be Russia, and it's going to be Russia. I mean, I spoke to a guy who lives in Luhansk, and he told me, he said, if you came here to Luhansk, you would not think that you're in Ukraine unless someone told you. He said, you're living in Russia. You have Russian soldiers everywhere. Everyone's speaking Russian. He said, there's really no chaos happening here. Life is normal. Everything is just business as usual. But again, this was like, I had this conversation about 2 years ago, so I don't know what has happened in that guy's area. Maybe things have changed, but he was telling me, he said, it's Russia. This is not Ukraine. It is Russia. Because during my conversation with this guy, I was saying, so how is it like living in Ukraine right now? And he said, what are you talking about? This isn't Ukraine. This is not Ukraine. This is Russia. And he was very serious with me. So the Ukrainians are going to have to give up territory in order to have a peace agreement with the Russians. And here's another question that I have: if the Americans are so interested in intensifying and escalating this whole conflict into a even greater war, then why did Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, make a phone call to Putin saying that he was interested in a peace deal? So you have the soon-to-be President of the United States saying, I'm going to make a deal. You have the current Chancellor of Germany saying, I want to make a deal with the Russians, a peace deal. And then months before Trump takes office, you have Biden saying, okay, go ahead and fire the missiles, Ukraine. Go ahead, you can do it. And everyone's freaking out. It makes me wonder if the powers that be, so to speak, are saying, we got to pull back. We need a rest. We need a hiatus from this war thing. We need to regroup, refresh. Ukraine needs to regroup and refresh and retrain and get new recruits. Europe needs to build up its military apparatus. Germany needs to build up its military might and revive its military might to deal with the Russians. We got to pull back. So we need to get the president to be the peacemaker, the hero. And I'm guessing they want to project and to present this image of Trump as the peacemaker. This is just me theorizing here. I'm not saying this is 100%. I can't prove this. But just looking at what they did with Reagan, how they made Reagan look like the guy who saved the hostages, I'm wondering if they're doing the same thing with Trump in regards to this whole disaster between Russia and Ukraine. It really makes you wonder. And what happened after, because we're talking about the rise of various NATO countries, Germany, Turkey. What happened when Trump was president the first time was we saw a major shift in policy towards Turkey. And what I mean by that is the United States, under Trump, told Turkey to enter Syria. And Turkey deployed troops into northern Syria. And we never saw something like that. Now, Turkey was backing the revolution against Bashar al-Assad. That's true. But before Trump, we did not see a president. We didn't see Obama telling the Turks, go right ahead into northern Syria and put your troops there. But when Trump was president, he told Turkey, it's yours. Because remember what Trump said. He said, we're sick and tired of dealing with Syria. Let someone else handle it. It's just a desert tainted with blood. It's a desert stained with blood. Let someone else take care of it. And that someone else was Turkey. And the Americans under Trump told the Turks, send your troops in there. And Turkey obliged happily. Why? Because Turkey wants to revive its power. And I think that this increase in Turkish power, this revival in Turkish power, is going to be even bigger. It's going to intensify under Trump's administration. Turkey wants to control Central Asia. It wants to control Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. It wants to control those Turkic countries. It wants to control Azerbaijan. It really already controls Azerbaijan, but Turkey wants to create its own Turkic NATO, and it wants to lead this confederacy of Turkish countries. And if you have this confederacy of Turkish countries, you're talking about a massive, massive power with very, very sought after resources like natural gas. And if Turkey manages to actually revive its power and it starts to actually control Central Asia, it will be a huge threat to Russia because Russia is right next to Central Asia. And so America needs time, NATO needs time to strengthen these regional powers like Germany and Turkey against the Russians. Because who are Russia's biggest historical enemies? Really, who are they? Turkey and Germany. Germany had two major wars against Russia, World War I and World War II. Turkey had numerous wars, specifically the Ottoman Empire, which is just the Republic of Turkey now, had numerous wars with the Russians, and they lost all of them. The Russians always defeated the Turks, and in both world wars, the Russians were doing very good in World War I until the Germans backed a Leninist revolution there. But in World War II, the Russians vanquished the Germans. And so there is this aspiration to revive German power and defeat the Russians. And one of Germany's highest ranking commanders, Mr. General, I think his name is General Freuding, this guy said that Russia is the biggest threat to Germany. So you have the Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying, I want to make peace with the Russians, but then you have this high-ranking German commander saying something else. He's saying that Russia is the biggest threat, the biggest enemy of the Russians, of the Germans. He's saying Russia is the biggest threat of Germany. So you have two different narratives here. One is saying, well, I want to make peace. The other is saying, no, we have to prepare for war with the Russians. Because that's what's happening. They're talking about peace. Olaf Scholz is talking about peace. Trump is talking about peace. But what is really happening here? What's really happening is NATO is taking a rest. The enemies of Russia have realized they're losing in Ukraine. They're not going to win. Ukraine is not going to win. And I'm pretty certain they knew that before. But I'm guessing that the whole motive behind supporting Ukraine was to drain the Russians. But still, nonetheless, it is an embarrassment to NATO because of the fact that 20% of Ukraine is now under Russia. And so these countries, these enemies of Russia, they need a rest. They got to pull back. Germany needs time. And remember what happened with the Minsk Agreement. What happened with the Minsk Agreement? The Germans and the French, they had the Normandy talks with the Russians, and they said, okay, we're going to have this peace deal. We're going to have this ceasefire. We're going to stop the fighting in Donbass. And then what happened? Fighting eventually resumed. And Angela Merkel came out after she left the position of Chancellor of Germany. She came out and she said the whole Minsk agreement was done solely for the reason to just gain time to further empower the Ukrainians against the Russians, to further arm and further train the Ukrainians against the Russians. It wasn't peace. It was simply time to re-strengthen themselves against the Russians. That's all it was. Before World War I, what were the Germans doing? They weren't acting like they wanted to go to war with Russia. They were acting like life was normal. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand was murdered, and they were saying, okay, everything's normal. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, we don't even like that guy anyway. His wife, Sophie, whatever her name was, who cares about her? And then what happened? The Austrians invaded Serbia. They were butchering the Serbs, exterminating the Serbs. They were using the Croatians to butcher the Serbs. It was absolutely horrifying. And the Germans were saying, oh, it's just a regional war. It's just a conflict in the Balkans. And then what happened? The Germans invaded Belgium. The Germans invaded France. They pulled the British into the war. Then they pulled the Russians into the war. And that was the whole goal. The whole goal of World War I for the Germans was to defeat the Russians. It was to crush Russia's power because Russia truly was the biggest obstacle for German power in Europe. The British and the French, the Germans could have easily defeated them. And the Germans were defeating them. And so they gave Lenin a whole bunch of gold to fund his Leninist Marxist revolution to overthrow the Russian government, to remove the Russians from the war, to get the Russians out of the way. Once the Russians were out of the way, then the Germans needed to just focus on defeating the French and the British, and that wasn't too difficult. Then the Americans came and spoiled everything for the Germans. World War II, Hitler made a deal, a non-aggression agreement with Stalin, and then what happened? Boom, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. The German government brokered the Minsk Agreement. There was supposed to be peace between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And what were the Germans, what were the Westerners doing behind the curtains? They were training and arming the Ukrainians, getting them ready for a war against Russia. So now the Americans and the Germans are talking about a peace deal with the Russians. What is this? It's a trick. That's what this is. It's a trick. The Americans need time. So they're bolstering this image of Trump as a peacemaker. Again, I can't prove this point. This last point that I just made, I can't prove it, but this is my analysis based on what I read about the Iran hostage crisis and how there was a conspiracy to bolster up the image of Reagan as the fearless, heroic American who freed the hostages. And I think that they want to boost up the image of Trump as the peacemaker. And I think that's what's happening. They want to help the rise of Turkey. They want to help the rise of Germany, and they need time. So the Ukrainians fired some missiles, and it wasn't even really a major attack. Let's be real here. According to the Russians, the Ukrainians fired 6 missiles. The Russians managed to take down 5 of them. 1 of them got damaged, but it still managed to land, and it hit a Russian ammo depot. Nobody died. It was not, physically speaking, this was not a major attack. But it is major in the sense that you have a NATO ally hitting Russia directly. Not hitting Russia and Ukraine, but actually hitting Russia itself. That is serious. So this is an escalation in a sense, but I also suspect that it's a way to boost up Trump as a peacemaker, terrify everyone, make everyone long for a Trump presidency, and then have a peace agreement, and then everyone's going to calm down, and they're going to love Trump because he saved us from World War III. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. And I just want to add that I may be wrong about all this, and this may actually be a serious escalation. I just want to add that in there because I'm just making my analysis, and I want to cover any possibility as to what is going on. But this is my analysis. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.